Welcome to the Tank Podcast. In this episode, Emily Segal joins Guy McKinnon Little to talk about cons, a temporal culture, and her debut novel Mercury Retrograde.
Oh, sorry, just I'm having problems.
No, of course we would encounter technical difficulties and be interrupted while trying to talk about Mercury Retrograde.
Yes. Okay, we're good. Okay, sorry. Continue. I'm so sorry to interrupt.
I know it's so fine. We're here to talk about like your novel about information breakdown. So it's only fitting that we embed it into the podcast itself. So after a number of years of doing all this trend forecasting work with K-Hole and Nemesis and elsewhere, you started this press Deluge and you put out your first novel, Mercury Retrograde. And I thought maybe a good place to begin would just be if you could sort of like say a bit about what's going on with that titular concept, which is obviously describes an astrological phenomena, but is also, you kind of use it in a much more capacious sense to sort of as a kind of keyword or world hash to kind of pick up on something of the sensibility of the kind of the historical moment of the early 2010s the book describes. So yeah, if you could sort of unpack what's going on there.
Okay, so basically the core of the novel was spurred by an essay that I wrote in 2015 that was published in eFlux Journal called Mercury Retrograde. And that essay was sort of the sourdough starter of the novel, or the kombucha SCOBY, or whatever you want to call it. It sort of gave rise to the rest of the book. And at the time, I had become really fascinated by Mercury Retrograde as a cultural meme that went far beyond the professional or spiritual understanding of astrology. So people who often bragged about not believing in astrology would also attribute their life being fucked up to Mercury Retrograde. And I noticed that the number and intensity of mentions of Mercury Retrograde were accelerating in my sphere. And at the time, my study of astrology was definitely in the sort of mass media basic bitch sphere. It was, since then, I've learned which, I have a lot of appreciation for, and I think is very common, of course. And since then, I've learned a great deal about astrology. But at the time, I was operating from a more layman's perspective, albeit one that was very much interested in my monthly horoscope or whatever. I cared a lot. So basically, I was interested in this more as a cultural meme and less as, a deeply astrological or spiritual phenomenon. And concurrently, I was having a bit of a meltdown and really felt like the way that I looked when I got dressed was a total mess. And I felt very inept fashion-wise, which of course sounds completely banal, but it ended up being the entry point for me into reassessing how I kind of looked at the functioning of society writ large, which of course sounds rather grandiose, but basically in traditional astrological formulations, things like vanity and beauty and the way that you look are ruled over by Venus. And so when a planet retrogrades, whatever it rules tends to go haywire in some way. So theoretically, if you hate your outfit, that's a Venus retrograde thing. But it was happening for me during Mercury retrograde, and Mercury rules information, communication, thieves, travelers, doorways, liminal spaces, etc., but absolutely is the ruler of information. So I started thinking about how, at the time, you could kind of look at our society as an information economy that was constantly glitching, and fashion could just be one subset of that. The phrase became like a colloquial signal that people were aware of something falling through the cracks, or it was a way to acknowledge the way that technology wasn't working. And at the time, there was so much techno-utopianism. There was so much unfettered and rather delusional excitement around how technology was frictionless and changing society and driving all of this supposed growth. And I saw Mercury retrograde as a way to sort of like touch the underside of that, however unwittingly. So the book, important to note, is not about astrology, and it's not even really about Mercury retrograde. It just is about a particular moment where this quote unquote information society reached a very strange, decadent boiling point. And the main character, who shares my name and a great deal of my biography, although not all of it, is sort of accessing the cracks and fissures of that culture. So I thought that it was a nice match.
The other thing that comes out as interesting is the way that it is kind of Mercury retrograde as a sort of like lens through which to pass this kind of like very particular kind of like overwhelmingly complex like information system, but it's also kind of speaks to this like everyday concept that people are kind of deploying, what the first person perspective on that whole situation looks like. And I guess with that in mind, it would maybe be interesting to hear a bit about sort of like when the kind of the format of like a sort of first person novel with a character who shares your name and much of your biography, but not all of it, kind of came into being. I mean, was it sort of like, was there something particular about that form that offered you something that you wouldn't be able to get via, like other mediums like a report or kind of essay or something? Or was it kind of a question of like, something more emergent where you didn't really maybe know that you were like writing the book when you're writing the book, or you didn't quite know what the thing was that you're working on? It just kind of like coalesced somehow.
Sure. So originally, I had intended to collect a group of essays that I had written over the period of working on K-Hole, which was the trend forecasting group and art collective that I ran with 4 other people for 5 years. And I had, over the period of working on those projects and reports, had amassed some cache of writing about cultural patterns and aesthetics and drugs and all these various topics that interested me. And I had intended to sort of create a narrative spine that would tie them all together. And then in attempting to compose that narrative spine, it sort of took on a life of its own and became the focus of my writing process. And that started to kind of become more compelling than just, a sort of like organizational principle that might help a book come together. It became an exciting writing project in its own right. And then another serendipitous thing happened, which is that my friend and mentor, Doug Copeland, who I very much admire, was giving me some advice about how to write a book, which I already found like so surreal and exciting. I like wanted to pinch myself because I really look up to his work. And Doug was a bit spaced out and kept referring to my book as a novel, even though that was not my intention at the time. And serendipitously enough, that actually made me think of the book as a novel. I tried to on for size the sort of like random reference to what I was working on as a novel and thought, oh, what if this were a novel? And then I should also say that I'm just very inspired by many writers who have used the quote unquote auto-fiction form, and writers that might not exactly fit in that category, but I personally think sort of fit in the lineage of that. So Eileen Miles, Bernadette Mayer, a lot of the new narrative writers, Michelle T, of course, Chris Kraus. There is this whole lineage of more or less female, sometimes queer, sometimes not, sometimes art adjacent, sometimes not, often poetry adjacent writers who have, played with this form where part of what happens to the reader is that you're invited to wonder how much of it is true. And gimmicky or not, I'm rather fond of that. I find it kind of addictive to wonder. I also say that there's another way of looking at what I was up to, which has a little bit more to do with anthropology. So in a way, what I was attempting was sort of like a fictional ethnography or a piece of thick description, like long form writing that can be narrative and has to do with some sort of like in situ immersion is of course essential to ethnography, which is a genre that I look at as literary, even though it doesn't necessarily function as a literary genre, and that I'm very, very much a fan of. So the other way of looking at the book is as like a piece of thick description or a like semi ethnographical work that tried to account for these sort of like failed experiments that I was doing in in art and in culture and in technology in the 2010s. Yeah, that's the other lens that I would provide.
But it's interesting within that then to sort of, it kind of does this reversal where you're not sort of like fictionalizing your own experiences, as is often the kind of the way it's probably most commonly spoken about with autofiction, where it's, you know, you're sort of changing names and obfuscating things or whatever. It's kind of the inverse of that, where the project is autoethnography and trying to kind of encapsulate something of being in that place at that time at this particular historical moment where all these forces are converging. And then fiction is kind of a tool to kind of grasp towards that, rather than something which is kind of, which does that, you know, there is obviously that element of intrigue that you're talking about, but it's ultimately kind of in service of like adding to that sense of like immersion or kind of directness or like immediacy, I guess.
Sure. I mean, what can be beat for the immersiveness of a book that you can't put down? Not saying that my book is going to be that for everybody, but I was very, very much interested in the bingeability factor and books that you read in one sitting or books that you stay up all night reading. Just because that from the time of childhood, that's in such a powerfully comforting force in my own life. And I also just love how sickening it can be in a way, but it's sickening in a way that's different than binging TV, where you just feel like depleted. It can be kind of like, it does something different. So I was very, very interested in that mechanism, and I tried to pull it off. And some people say that I have, and I'm sure other people don't feel that way. It's of course a very personal thing, but that's part of what I was after.
Yeah, I want to come back to that because I encountered that idea of like binge reading, listening to the Michelle T talk, and I think it's really kind of compelling by the way that it kind of like dodges all these like opposites. But to like pause that for now, I think it's also, it would be interesting to hear about how you kind of then situate the book in relation to your other work or other projects that you've kind of been involved in, where, you know, there's a kind of like a sort of crude contrast where you kind of look at like, you know, like a K-hole trend report, and then, you know, kind of independently published like piece of autofiction sort of feels like the opposite of that in a certain sense.
How so? I'm curious.
Well, I guess there's a kind of, again, like this is a crude characterization. I guess you'd be like, okay, small press, there's a sense of scale and insularity and speaking to this kind of like audience. Or there's like or at least there's that kind of redeployment of corporate aesthetics is certainly absent, right? But then,
got it. Yeah, I see what you're saying now.
But then there's obviously quite obvious affinities between them as well, where there's like, it's that joke about like art directors just finding a way to kind of monetize their niche teenage interests, where, you know, like you kind of expand from this like biography to try speak to like a broader cultural pattern. So even if it is a very like strictly kind of like structural, like who's buying and selling and doing what, you're still kind of, you know, there's still this first person avatar that is putting it forward. Or even if you look at like, you know, the kind of the characters who inhabit many of these reports, whether it's like, but to kind of cut myself short, yeah, I just think it would be interesting to sort of think about, I don't know, the continuities and discontinuities between those two things.
Okay, well, where to begin? So K-hole as a project began almost 10 years ago, which is outrageous, among a group of friends who are all in their very early 20s and trying to figure out how to make artwork or function as poets, designers, visual artists, etc., while also supporting themselves, which led us to a smattering of jobs as very junior people in particular offices where corporate trend forecasting reports were circulating or were hanging out on servers. And we became obsessed with them as strange and hilarious ephemera that seemed more information rich and dense than a lot of the contemporary art that we saw circulating in our sphere at the time, although addressed many of the same themes. And so we started with the first report that came out in 2011 in a spirit of fan fiction, almost like a zine, to make one ourselves. And that led to 5 years of developing a very, very robust, rich, and complicated collective writing project, which is not usually what we talk about when we talk about K-hole, but that's really a huge part of what was going on. And if you could have heard the fights that we had over prepositions, it's so geeky and kind of absurd, but we put so much work into developing a voice and figuring out how to technically construct texts that blended all of our voices and blended all of our ideas in a way that felt fresh and recognizable. And then by the end of the 5 years, all of us could just kind of launch into K-hole voice. It became a sort of more muscle memory type of skill, but it was in a very beautiful way, profoundly collaborative textual exercise. And writing a novel is the opposite of that. Of course, writing a novel is incredibly collaborative at certain parts of the process. And the book literally would not exist if it were not for the various people who edited it, both as friends and in a more professional capacity. But I wrote the whole thing. I sat down and I learned this difficult craft, and I sort of worked out every single last bit of it myself. I've said before, writing a novel is like knitting a movie, like every single bit needs to be worked out. And it was really like the individual responsibility, the scale, and the heavy craft element that distinguish it in my personal practice from what I was working on with K-hole. Because when you are working with 5 people, you can always be like, oh, hey, you do a little bit of this. Oh, what do you think about this? Oh, send it back to me. Oh, actually, no, I remixed the whole thing last night when I couldn't sleep. Oh, what do you think? That's just could not be more different from the way that I approached working on this book. So that is a way to distinguish them on a more personal and practice level. In terms of what both projects are kind of doing out in the world and what you were bringing up in terms of the corporate aesthetics versus more niche indie bit, I'd say that, part of what we were trying to do with K-hole and in a different way with Nemesis, which is my current project, was to address as large of an audience as possible. That was very much true for K-hole, unless it's not exactly what Nemesis is after per se, although it's relevant. And of course, when you start a queer indie press, you're not trying to necessarily address the largest possible audience. And so, yes, there is just sort of a plain difference there. But I also think that there's a lot of interesting work to be done in collapsing those categories. And of course, the internet makes it all possible. I mean, 500,000 people downloaded K-hole reports because they were free and you could just download them. And because normcore became such a big meme, and because of other ways that we were lucky to sort of penetrate pop culture at a particular moment, it circulated really widely and a lot of people read it. And so it got into the, bloodstream of a particular type of person, which is really interesting. And I'm really curious to see with Deluge, the press, what the audience ends up being like, because it's still so nascent. And we've only put out my book so far, and we actually have 3 more books coming out this year at least. So, things are going to develop as they develop. I do think that the literary world, whatever that means, has a kind of remarkably warped view of its end user that I find quite sad. And I think that people love reading, and a lot of people read books. And literary fiction, in terms of the way that it sees itself, limits itself considerably, and sometimes in invisible ways. And also, of course, discounts genre fiction, discounts a lot of the reading that people do as not quote unquote literary. And so I am invested in probing and hopefully dismantling some of those boundaries and categories as part of the work of Deluge. But in terms of how it ends up and what it ends up resulting in, I think it will be quite different.
To kind of pivot from that a bit as well, it's kind of related in some ways in terms of but the other thing I wanted to talk about is this kind of notion of how you kind of you open the book with this Alice Notley quote that experience is a hoax. And I found that really interesting because it just seemed to collect up a whole bunch of different things where, on the one hand, as you were saying earlier, experience is kind of central to the book's methodology. It's very much about this kind of this vivid sense of placing you in the thick of things rather than sort of taking a step back or offering critique or a kind of redemptive arc or something like that. But then there's also this inverse to it where in the Nemesis Umami report, you talk about the kind of the death of the experience economy. And there's obviously this tension there between, something which is very commodified and superficial and, ephemeral. And then this idea of something which is also in the word experience with like something which is direct and immediate and kind of like bypasses all those things somehow. So I don't know. I guess it just seemed like a word which like collects up all these different kind of complicated knots of meaning. And I'd be curious to think about how you sort of understand it as like both a methodology and a kind of buzzword which like circulates in the broader cultural sphere.
That's such a beautiful question. And I love how you brought all of those different valences together. I love that Alice Notley line experience is a hoax for a few reasons. One is that in writing the book, I was continually amused by how much quote unquote real life doesn't make sense and how necessary fictionalizing is to make a particular event or story or moment legible. So there seems to be some sort of major epistemological or ontological thing going on there, or at least that's what I felt like I was dealing with, where it was sort of like in setting out to explain something that really happened. So let's say some of the early writings that led to the book, I wasn't trying to write fiction. I was just trying to write about stuff that happened. But then in order to make it make sense, I had to fictionalize it, because I found that real life was so overdetermined. There were so many factors and people involved in every moment. Each one was a total can of worms. And it never really made sense when you tried to nail it down in the most sort of like practical, clear-eyed ways. So that Alice Notley line experience as a hoax spoke to that tension. The poem that it comes from also is about how relating to men as a young woman can kind of at first bamboozle you into thinking that you need to really like learn from and absorb what these sort of like illustrious men who've come before you have done. And it's the poem sort of like, in my view, maps like a process of either disillusionment or coming out of that cocoon or that sense in a way that I found relevant to the themes of the book. So I also loved that about it. And yeah, I guess to put it more concretely, I just think that it's an amazing description of what autofiction is. This idea that you're reading this quote unquote personal experience and it kind of usually seems like it's true, but you also know that it is a hoax and untrue on a certain level. And then to just like kind of wrap it up, we're also dealing with in the book like these various sort of like cons, like the con of like starting a startup and getting like absolutely ungodly amounts of VC money for it, or the con of getting a job but actually trying to make an artwork out of the job, or the con of tricking yourself into thinking that the people around you have your best interests at heart when they probably don't, or whatever it is. So the hoax as a sort of like more humorous read on deception is relevant thematically to the book. It's interesting to think about it in terms of the experience economy, which I must admit I haven't quite, but of course makes sense as a connection. I think you brought it up a bit in your question, like, what is passed off as a commercialized or commodified experience is not the only kind of experience, of course, and often, makes a bigger claim for itself as a quote unquote real thing than it needs to, like whatever festival culture or like museum of ice cream type of experience economy we're thinking of is relevant here. And I have participated in that economy, like happily and unhappily at various moments. To me, like I am happy in certain ways that the experience economy seems to be shifting and changing form, because it has been an enormous ripoff in a lot of ways and does have to do with financialization, which is what the umami theory of value report is really about. It has to do with the ways that a process of financialization in the economy where markets are developing in a way that is super disconnected from what's happening on the ground gets reflected in cultural objects and ideas of prestige. So you get tons of mashups of sort of incomprehensible, if you have to ask, you'll never know types of like inscrutable luxury fashion, and got to be there in the blink of an eye or you'll miss it types of, like conferences and art world things and concerts and destination weddings, etc. And just like the idea that like you should spend more and more money and have less and less to show for it, which is of course a problem. And a lot of those things are being reconfigured because of the pandemic, and we'll see how the chips fall on the other side. But on a personal level, the experience thing has to do with something entirely different, like something that to me really doesn't have to do with the quote unquote experience economy. It has more to do with a squeamishness that I've observed among artists and writers, like a desire for purity, the idea that if you are around the wrong type of people, if you have the wrong type of job, if that you're somehow like tainted and that takes away from your art. And I think that that's a limited viewpoint. I think that there is so much to be found out there in the world. And even in some of the weirder, more problematic, more grim corporate corners that I found myself in, I've also been fascinated by the humanity present. And I think that the sort of artist's view that doing stuff like that is like, taints one's ability to create art is really problematic. So my insistence on experience is like coming from what is maybe a very American interest in like omnivorousness and like adventure, I guess, and like a willingness to not look at yourself as too delicate. That was a bit of a ramble, but that's my free association for you on the word experience.
No, it's interesting. I also didn't read the word experience in that quote at all as like meaning experience in the sense of like accumulated like worldliness, I guess, which I guess it also has that meaning. And it kind of takes on a whole different resonance once it's there. It kind of reads a bit like a sort of like corporate tagline in a way, in quite a nice way. Like fake it till you make it or something.
Right. I mean, it has this sense of like, oh, listen to me, little girl, I've got all the experience and you don't know what you're talking about. And what she's saying is that experience is a hoax. She's also saying many other things because it's Alice Notley and it's a gorgeously multivalent work. But I appreciate that because I've observed it to be true personally.
Even in the most humane corporate settings, I imagine.
Everyone brings their whole self everywhere they go. You know what I mean? And that is an extraordinary thing to witness and to participate in.
The other thing I wanted to ask about, though, is also the kind of the timeline of the book in kind of a number of senses. You kind of mentioned earlier that the sort of like the kind of germinal seed of the whole thing was the Mercury Retrograde essay for Efflux, which I think came out in 2015. So it's quite quite a fairly long amount of time. And I guess I was thinking on a personal level how my reception or how I'd have read this like cultural object differently had it come out like kind of in the midst of that moment. And like how all the different resonances it would have kind of set off would have been like really different to what they are now, where there is that sense of like, it's only 5 years, but it's like, feels like 5 years means more with like each passing 5 years. It's like this kind of like ever narrowing like window of like nostalgia where like, there was a time is like any time that isn't right now. So I thought that was interesting, that kind of like just the, the experience of perhaps like sitting with the project whilst the world changes and like what that feels like, and B, just kind of like how, what it feels like to be putting it out into the world now when there is like that sense of distance or a gap or kind of collective effort to try kind of make sense of this really strange, like incomprehensible cultural moment.
I'm quite pleased that it ended up coming out a little bit further away from the period that it was describing, although I don't think that I felt that way, at certain points of the process when I was really like hot to trot and wanted it to come out as soon as possible. But I think ultimately I'm quite pleased because it does emphasize the part of the book that is a micro history, and it gives us a little bit of room to look at this moment in culture and reflect on it. And it does feel more historical and strange and far away. And then it also asks us to think about what 5 years is. I remember the artist Ryan Trecarton, who's a friend of mine, saying to me that an age difference of 5 years is one of the weirdest age differences there is between two people, because it's so close and so far, yet so far. And I think that we get a little taste of that in trying to reflect on this time that is close, and we can still trace many of the things that are going on now to that time, but it doesn't feel viscerally close at all. And it isn't. Like, so many things about the world are totally different. So I think that ended up being a good thing. But the process of writing the book was very interesting, and of course, like, quite frustrating, as I imagine like every single person in the world's first novel is. I had written that essay for eFlux that came out in 2015, and I had a lot of other fragments of writing. And it was also in 2015 or so that I made a shift in my own personal practice and was basically like, I'm going to write all the time starting now. Like, it's time to get really serious about writing, which was something that I had always wanted to do and feared and felt guilty about not having done yet, et cetera, which is something that I think is shared by a lot of writers. And so I started trying to generate a lot more text and also learn about what you had to do to your life and your person and your brain in order to be able to do that, like physically and otherwise, which took a lot of work. And then after about 2 years of a great deal of writing, I had the amazing good fortune of working with an editor who's also a good friend, who did this very cool maneuver where she basically took everything that I had written and put it into what she believed to be chronological order. So not what it said was chronological order, because that wasn't necessarily clearly signaled in the text itself, but what she as a reader believed to be chronological order. And that was something that unlocked the process for me. And then I sort of developed a very loose 3-act structure based on that exchange, and then sort of like rewrote the book from the beginning based on all this text that I already generated and this new structure that I worked out with my editor. That took a while. And then I was very lucky to get a literary agent. And then I was in the mix of trying to get my book published by a quote unquote real publisher. And that is a very, very slow process, as anyone who's ever done it will tell you. So that was interesting because I got priceless feedback from my agent and from the various editors at different publishing houses that I was in touch with. So I'm extremely grateful for that. But I was also losing my mind, tearing my hair out around how long it was taking. And there was something so weird about writing a book that was in a way rather timely, and it was just becoming less and less timely by the second. And of course, this is one of the very interesting, questions and predicaments of fiction as a mode, because it's something that takes so long and so much labor to create. I mean, this is what like Elif Batuman's PhD thesis was about. It's like the time to write versus the life that's being written about. Like, how do you kind of ever account for that differential or that equation? So in a way, the book coming out a little bit further away from the period that it described, which had to do with all of these like very practical matters around like me learning to write, me figuring out how to edit the book, me engaging with these different people who were trying to help me figure out how to get it published, ended up also contributing to what it did as an art gesture out in the world, which is kind of cool. It didn't feel like that at the time. It just felt like hellish, basically, but I'm happy that that's what happened at the end of the day.
What I really liked in what you're just saying now is this idea that it's kind of has been structured in perceived kind of chronological order, and that kind of like, that like temporal confusion is really interesting, because I think it's sort of like, in response to what you're just saying now about like the kind of role of fiction to kind of like, catch up with life. I guess that's even like sort of, there's another contrast as well, which is the sort of like the publishing cycle of a novel versus, the kind of like near instantaneous kind of like reproductive cycles of like trends and fashion and so on and so forth, where it becomes, as you've like said in the Mercury Retrograde issue, there's no gap between basically like producing a t-shirt and producing like a JPEG of a t-shirt. And this kind of feels like a sort of counterpoint to that in a way, or at least like in discussion with it in a way that is kind of weary, like aware of that dissonance rather than trying to like disavow it. Like I can remember when like Olivia Lang's Crudo came out, whenever it came out a few years ago, there's all this hype of like, oh, you're like writing a novel in real time and like you're responding to the moment. And that's kind of necessarily going to be like a failed endeavor, I think, to some extent. And I like the idea of kind of embracing the kind of the contradiction of like what you're setting out to do.
I'm totally with you. A novel is by definition not really going to be able to address the present moment fully. I'm thinking of Bernadette Mayer's Midwinter Day, which is a very long poem. And the legend of that poem is that it was written in one day, the day that it describes. And that's sort of what you break your head over the whole time. It's like, well, how could you be making and eating that sandwich and writing this amazing poem about it all in the same moment? You know, it puts this gorgeous pressure on the temporality of what you're taking in and asks you to sort of entertain these kind of like multiple universes happening at the same time. I'm very fascinated by that. And yeah, I mean, I love things that are super fast and responsive. I think it's a really just unique and occasionally sickening part of the culture that we live in. But I'm super down with novel writing not being that. I think that there's a lot to be said for the period of gestation and just how weird it is to de-link from the everyday churn of information and try to build your own reality in your head and on the page. It's just like a really valuable exercise. The other thing that comes to mind is the problem of, for example, Keeping Up with the Kardashians, where everything that was on the show was already on social media like months before it was on the show. And it becomes this like weird problem where like everyone who would be watching the show in theory also would be following the people on the show on social media and already would know the thing. Or like how luxury shoppers see clothes on the runway and then want to buy and wear them instantly, but they're not stocked for 6 more months, at which point they seem terribly old and out of step. So these questions of temporal disjuncture are at the heart of media consumption anyway, and writing a novel as this just like outrageously laborious task sort of like troubles it in yet another way.
That's so beautifully put, and maybe a good spot to end on. Thanks so much for taking the time to chat, Emily.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for reading. Really appreciate it. It's amazing to me that people are reading my book. I can't believe it. Okay, well, have a good rest of your evening and talk to you soon.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, you can subscribe on all major podcast platforms or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is by Himera.